This is not a how to build a shed video. It's a bunch of tips, tricks, and lessons learned so you don't make as many mistakes as I did. My shed is a Yardline Backyard Products Ridgepoint 8-foot by 12-foot model that I purchased at Costco. While some of these tips are specific to that particular shed, many of these tips will help you no matter what shed kit you buy. I'm not a builder, I'm not a carpenter. I'm an old geezer and I'm a handy guy. I've never built a shed before. I figured out certain solutions that work for me. They may not be what a builder would do, but they work for me and I think they'll work for you. The tips and tricks will help you turn this into this. That's a picture of my finished shed. Here are some of the basics. You can either read through the slides or listen to me walk you through them. The materials were generally good quality. Some of the wood was bowed or twisted, and it was hard to keep some of the tolerances. A few of the pieces were unusable or had black mold. The company will either replace the defective wood or reimburse you with receipts. If I were you, I'd buy your own wood. It'll be better quality. Send them the receipts and they'll send you a check in a couple of weeks. The shrink wrap bundle is not packaged in order of use. You're going to have to unload the entire brick before you can start building your shed. It's good to use a simple method to organize everything as you unpack. I grouped all the trim, all the sheet goods, all the hardware together. The more organized you are, the less time you'll spend picking through piles of random pieces. Using a nail gun is a game changer. Also, if this is going to take you more than a few days and you're in an area where it tends to rain, buy a tarp for the unfinished roof, because you know what? It's going to rain. Nail guns save a huge amount of time and effort. The 2-in-1 nailer in particular handled all the trim, and more important, it lets you position OSB panels, the floor, the siding, and the roof, before you secure them with the nails. The framing nailer handles all the 2 and 3-inch nails. It was $100. The compressor, also $100, is the standard Porter Cable 6-gallon pancake compressor. It worked great and never ran out of air. The game changer was the 2-in-1 Brad staple nailer from Harbor Freight. What it allowed me to do was it allowed me to position things without nailing them all the way in. I bought everything for about $230 and then I resold it on Craigslist for $150. I also found a couple of extra inexpensive tools to help with the job. I bought some $4 clamps from Harbor Freight. They were great for holding things together and holding them in position. The other thing I bought was a good quality 1-inch angled paintbrush. And the reason is that you're going to want to end up painting your trim using a good brush to kind of cut it in. We'll talk about that later. It's important to know that some of the mistakes you make are going to be covered up by the trim, so just don't drive yourself crazy. Every place that you see white trim, that covers up either an edge or some other area where another edge is exposed. So all that's going to be covered up. You don't need to worry about it. The same thing is true under the eaves and places like that. There are fascia boards there, and they also cover up some of the mistakes you're going to make. The only raw edge you're really going to see is along the bottom, so make sure to make that bottom edge even. Your success depends on a level foundation. Every single shed building video tells you this. It takes more time and effort than you think, so just go slowly and don't cut corners. My foundation is simple. It's 4x4 ground contact pressure treated runners on 2-inch pavers and 3/4-inch crushed stone. Best thing to do is watch a video, take your time, measure twice. Even if you're careful, the foundation may settle a fraction of an inch after it rains, or possibly once the shed is built and it starts to settle. You may have to compensate for minor movements as you go along. The most important advice, just keep measuring. This was my biggest gotcha. When you make a frame that's more than 8 feet long, in all likelihood, the manufacturer sent you an 8-foot 2x4 and a 4-foot 2x4, or something like that, which means that one of the joints in that frame is going to have to be toe-nailed. Toe-nailing is not so easy, and the frame needs to be square, flat, and level. In my case, there was an 8-footer and a 4-footer. If you have experience with toe-nailing, you may be fine, but all the lumber isn't exactly 100% straight. The joints will probably separate slightly and bend a little right where they meet. It may measure up pretty well, mine did, but the floor panels are installed after you nail the frame down to the runners, so the panels may not line up perfectly once you're done. In order to facilitate building the frame alone, I bought an L-shaped bracket and clamped it to each joint before I nailed it. It kind of held the 2x4s in place and gave me a good nailing angle. It added a few extra minutes, but it assured me that the frame was as square as possible. Here's the lesson I learned, and I learned it the hard way. The manual tells you to secure the first panel with 2-inch nails and twist it into position. Well, if you nailed your frame to runners, that's hard to do. My first panel lined up reasonably well, but my second and third panels didn't. So I had to remove the first panel. It left a little bit of a mess. And then I had to lay down all 3 panels all at once. And when I did that, I was able to get them as square as possible, making sure there were no gaps between the panels. Then I was able to tack them in place with a 2-in-1 nailer. Don't worry if the outer edges are not perfectly even. You can trim them if you have to. The wall frames are going to cover them anyway. Once you're happy with the coverage of all 3 of the panels, that's when you can secure it with 2-inch nails. Here's a picture of what I went through. That top arrow, that's where the floor panel met at one side. You can imagine that on the other side it hung over by an equal amount. So what I had to do was trim the excess with a circular saw so that the wall sits flush to the frame. But don't worry, the walls cover the edges anyway. Note how the floor panel is square to the frame exactly at the toenail joint, but then it drifts away at the top because it wasn't perfectly square. The frame is already nailed to the 4x4 rails, so it really can't be adjusted. The one thing that is important to do with the bottom arrow is make sure that the floorboards are tight to each other along the horizontal edge, so there are no gaps in the flooring. Here's what I'm trying to tell you with the toenail joints. When you measure corner to corner and edge to edge, you're going to get pretty good measurements. Mine looked okay, and that's when I nailed the frame to the 4x4 runners. But the joints weren't perfect, and the floor panels were slightly off. It worked out fine because I trimmed the floor panels and the mistake is hidden under the walls. But if you look at that bottom diagram, you can see that if your floor frame is off by a little bit, and you're only off by 1/4 of an inch after 4 feet, if you keep going, you're going to be off an inch when you get to 12 feet. So you have to make some adjustments. And that's why if you mount all 3 boards, all 3 floorboards, you'll be in much better shape. My kit came with a loft shelf. I made the executive decision to skip the shelf because it was made out of OSB. It seemed flimsy and I really didn't need it. I did it especially because I screwed up and I put the loft support on the wrong side of the second rafter. Then when I nailed the rear gable in place, it was off exactly the thickness of that shelf. I realized that the gable support sits on top of the loft shelf. So my rear gable is off by the width of the shelf. It's not a disaster because it's in the back of the shed and you really don't notice, but don't skip the loft shelf. And if you do skip it, make sure you offset it about 1/2 inch. Here's good luck with this. That gable on the front consists of 20 separate pieces, and some of those pieces are just not perfect. Making and installing that front gable is a trip because it kind of sits precariously on its bottom edge. It seems like it has to be a mistake. In fact, the guy who was helping me said, "Have these guys ever heard about gravity?" Turns out it's not a mistake. Just to be sure, though, you need to secure it well. Oh, and the odds of getting everything just right so all the trim fits perfectly and it looks great, about 0. When you get to the walls, there are certain things you ought to remember. Sidewalls are like the floors, hard to get perfectly square. So again, position all 3 panels first. And remember, trim boards are going to cover 3 of the edges. Only the bottom edge is going to be visible when the shed is complete. So make that bottom straight and level. Panels should be snug to each other. You don't want any gaps. I installed the walls left side, back, right side. I secured them to the floor loosely with a few 3-inch screws. I measured and adjusted the walls as necessary to get everything as square as possible, and only then did I secure them to the floor. More important, the front opening has got to be perfect because, well, doors. And here they are, and they look so innocent. Building the front wall in advance seemed like a bad idea to me. It just seemed like after all the experiences I went through with the floor and the walls, that the likelihood of getting this thing exactly right was slim or none. So instead, I deconstructed it. Here's what worked for me. The first thing I did was I took that L-shaped piece, the vertical and the small horizontal piece, and I nailed them together to create two L's. The second thing I did was I measured at the bottom. I measured exactly 56 inches, and that's when I lightly screwed both the short boards to the flooring. After that, I secured the top board to the side walls. When I made sure that the opening was exactly square, and in my case 56 inches at top and bottom, that's when I secured the top boards to the studs. Finally, when everything was all set and all the measurements were right, I secured all the boards. I don't think this is a good idea either. The instruction manual tells you to strap the two doors together and then mount them as a unit. But as soon as I tried that and I picked them up, there was a lot of flex in there. So I decided I'm going to hang these doors separately because I need to make sure that they hang properly and the gap between the doors remains consistent. They also tell you to screw in a brace below the doors to rest the doors on as you mount it. Well, that's a great idea, except I positioned mine 1/4 of an inch too high. So I ended up having to remove it. That's when I made the decision to hang the doors individually. So I removed that board and I had a helper hold each door in place as I secured them individually. This is really important. The doors need to be square in 3 dimensions. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see that one of the doors is perfectly vertical and the other one is tilted slightly off axis. In the second picture, the doors are not equal heights. And in the third picture, this one's kind of tricky. You need to be sure that your door is vertically perfect. You don't want it leaning back or leaning forward, because then when you unlatch the doors, the door is either going to swing open or slam shut. What you want is what that little angel has over on the right. Perfect doors, square in 3 planes. Only then are you going to finish adding screws. Here are some of the issues that I'm talking about that happened with my shed. That picture in the upper left, that's what a twisted board looked like. I made the mistake of not picking the best board of that size for the front wall. In the second picture, you can see what happened on the other side. It's twisted in exactly the other direction. So it meant that I had to shim the door frames to keep everything square. That's the picture on the right, upper right. I had to make sure that the door opening was exactly 56 inches, or whatever your manual specifies, and I squared it all around. And that meant that that short framing piece did not meet the wall frame. My instinct would have been to butt that up against the frame before I nailed it, but in fact it needed that distance in order to hold that measurement. I worked alone building my shed. In order to accurately position the roof panels, I measured and screwed a lath board to the rafters. Then I slid the OSB panel into place, I nailed it, and then I removed the lath. Remember, I used that 2-in-1 nailer to position these boards to make sure that everything was square before nailing them all down. You need to make sure that the rafters are spaced evenly so you can work from inside to make sure that they're straight and evenly spaced. Things like the gable decoration were a pain to align. In that particular case, I stapled pieces in place before screwing them together. Also, note that the small gap at the apex doesn't show, so I didn't worry about it. It was thinking ahead and going, nobody's going to see this. I'm going to make it work as best as possible. This is what the front corner looked like when everything was put together. It's where every little mistake met. But there's nothing a little platinum patch and paint couldn't hide. This picture's from a few inches away on the right. From a couple of feet away, you can't see a thing. It looks great. I used Behr paint all around in a hot dog roller for the trim. It worked great, one coat. And then there was my genius plan. I went around the entire shed with painter's tape. Bad idea. The exterior is textured, so as you can see, the paint bleeds under the tape. Instead, use that tapered paintbrush I told you about in the beginning to cut in an edge. Maybe you need to practice a little bit doing it. It's not hard. Watch a video. You'll figure it out. It works great. What about the floor? Well, the OSB flooring won't withstand harsh weather and abuse. I live in New England. There are many ways to cover the OSB with something that'll stand up to the water, snow, and dirt that gets tracked in over time. I bought polyvinyl flooring from Home Depot in a 7.5 by 14 foot roll for $100. The width is perfect. I let it curl up just a little bit on the sides so any water wouldn't seep under it, and I cut it to fit at the door end. It worked like a charm. The ramp. Whichever foundation you use, the shed floor is going to be elevated above the ground. If you're storing things like lawnmowers and snow blowers inside, you're going to need a ramp. You'll need to figure out the rise and run depending on your situation. Be aware that the bottom of the door extends below the floor line. So when you're calculating the height of the ramp, do it with the doors closed. What went well? Well, the design is well thought out and quite attractive. The overall quality is very good. But you're going to have to work with some of the wood. Virtually all the places where rookies make mistakes are covered with trim, which is a nice feature. It can absolutely be a one-person project with a helper to lift and position a few heavy pieces. The frame is ground contact pressure treated. Windows are glass, exterior is primed. It's nice. Materials were properly sized, marked, and there were no missing pieces. The manual is actually pretty good for most everything. Except for the front wall and doors, I thought the sequencing and construction seemed appropriate. Even though they didn't provide roofing, which will cost you another $300, they explain how to complete it. Once the floor frame was complete, construction moved right along. It's an excellent value, especially from Costco, and even better when it's on sale. I ended up with a quality shed at a great price and saved at least $1,000 to $1,500. And that's my story. I had a lot of fun and I'm happy with the results. We had some rough weather and I'm an old geezer on Social Security, so it took a little time. I did almost everything by myself. I had someone help with the heavy lifting, and a friend finished shingling the upper reaches of the roof because my wife saw me dangling off a ladder up there and didn't want it to be a memorial shed. 20 years ago, I think I could have built the shed in about 3 days without killing myself. It took a little longer on geezer time. All the construction I didn't mention went smoothly. Being organized and methodical was half the battle. Measuring twice before nailing helped. Figuring out the things that didn't matter also saved a lot of time. So I hope you had fun, and good luck.